They laughed when Lindiwe walked into the courtroom wearing no designer label, no diamonds, no entourage. Her ex-husband's family sat tall in their polished confidence, certain they were about to watch a discarded woman beg for dignity. A lawyer smirked. Someone whispered that poverty had finally caught up with her. Then a sealed document changed hands, and the judge's face hardened. The room went still. The same people who had mocked her moments before suddenly could not breathe the same way. Because the woman they called worthless had entered that courtroom, carrying a truth powerful enough to ruin every lie they had built against her. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, what country are you watching from and what time is it there right now, and if stories of justice, healing, and unexpected redemption move you, subscribe and come with us on this journey. In Johannesburg, where polished glass towers could stand only a few streets away from cracked pavements and women selling fruit beneath faded umbrellas, people often mistook appearance for truth. They believed a fine suit meant discipline, a soft-spoken wife meant dependence, and a respectable family name meant decency. That was how most people had understood the marriage of Sizwe Dlamini and Lindiwe Maseko. On paper, it looked like a union, blessed by order, ambition, and grace. He was a rising attorney from a family that knew how to speak in measured tones, host elegant dinners, and make even cruelty sound like refinement. She was the quiet wife who smiled gently, dressed simply, and never fought for attention. To outsiders, the story was obvious. He was the man of stature. She was the woman lucky enough to be chosen. But a marriage is never made of paper, and what people call dignity can sometimes be nothing more than well-dressed pride. Lindiwe had not entered that marriage as an empty woman waiting to be shaped. Long before she met Sizwe, she had already lived several hard lives inside one body. She knew what it meant to count coins at sunrise before deciding whether bread or transport mattered more that day. She knew how to stretch a pot of stew to feed more people than it was meant for, how to smile at younger siblings when there was no reason to smile, how to stand in a queue for hours and return home with nothing but tired feet and another promise that tomorrow might be kinder. Hardship had not made her loud. It had made her observant. She listened more than she spoke. She noticed what people revealed when they thought no one important was watching. When Sizwe first met her, he mistook that quietness for softness. At the time, he liked it. Lindiwe was working at a small community resource office that helped women fill out grant forms, school applications, and local business permits. The office itself was modest, with old chairs that creaked when people sat down and a printer that seemed always to be fighting for its life. But the women who came there trusted Lindiwe. She explained things without making anyone feel small. She treated confusion with patience and desperation with respect. Sizwe had come there on behalf of a client one afternoon, irritated by the heat, pressed for time, and expecting inefficiency. Instead, he found Lindiwe carefully helping an elderly woman understand papers she could not read. There was nothing dramatic about the scene. Nothing cinematic, but something in the way Lindiwe leaned forward, fully present, as though the old woman's problem mattered as much as any boardroom dispute unsettled him, in a way he could not explain. He returned a week later, on another excuse. Then again. At first, his attention felt almost unreal to Lindiwe. Men like Sizwe did not usually look twice at women like her, not seriously. He was polished, without seeming vain, attentive, without appearing needy, and confident in the way people are when the world has mostly agreed with their existence. He spoke of law development and the country's future. He asked questions that suggested he saw her mind, not just her face. When he began visiting her at the office, with coffee, or waiting nearby so they could walk together after work, Lindiwe tried to be cautious. But caution is often weakest in people who have gone too long without being chosen tenderly. She wanted to believe that respect had finally found her. She wanted to believe that life did not only test a person, sometimes it rewarded them too. Sizwe courted her beautifully in the beginning. He brought her books because she had once mentioned loving to read, and he remembered details from conversations that even she had forgotten saying aloud. He listened when she spoke about her siblings, about township women who carried entire households on the strength of uncelebrated labor, about how poverty did not simply empty the pocket, but often rearranged the soul. He told her that what he admired most was her steadiness. He said she made noise seem unnecessary. Around him, Lindiwe began to feel safe enough to imagine a different life. What she did not yet understand was that admiration can hide possession inside it. Sometimes a man praises a woman for being calm because he cannot imagine what he would do if she ever spoke with full force. The Dlamini family home in Houghton was the first place that taught her this truth clearly. The house was large without being vulgar, decorated in creams, dark woods, and carefully chosen art that signaled wealth, the way perfume signals presence, not by shouting, but by lingering. When Sizwe first took Lindiwe there to meet his family, she wore a modest blue dress she had saved for weeks to buy. She had braided her hair neatly and borrowed earrings from a friend. She entered with hope, nervous but sincere, wanting to do well not for performance's sake, but because love had made her want peace with the people who shaped the man she was beginning to trust. Mamnomza Dlamini greeted her with a smile, so polished it almost looked kind. Sizwe's mother was a woman who understood hierarchy the way some people understand scripture. She did not need to insult anyone directly. Her pauses did the work for her. Her eyes knew how to travel slowly over a person's shoes, hands, and posture before landing on their face with a warmth that never reached the soul. Ayanda, Sizwe's younger sister, was less disciplined. She was fashionable, quick-tongued, and amused by nearly everything that did not come from her own world. If Mamnomza hid judgment behind courtesy, Ayanda let it glitter openly. Still, that first evening passed without open humiliation. There were soft questions, small smiles, and the kind of conversation that sounds welcoming until one hears what is not being asked. No one wanted to know what Lindiwe dreamed of building. No one asked how she had managed to support her siblings. No one seemed curious about the sharp intelligence behind her measured speech. Instead, Mamnomza asked whether Lindiwe found it difficult to adjust in more formal settings. Ayanda laughed lightly and said, "Sizwe had always liked simple women, as though simplicity were a decorative trait rather than an accusation." Sizwe squeezed Lindiwe's hand under the table as if to calm her, but he did not challenge them. He smiled. He moved the conversation along, and in that quiet failure, something important introduced itself into the relationship for the first time. Lindiwe told herself it was nothing serious. Families needed time. People from different backgrounds often misread each other. She had survived far worse than an awkward dinner table. But the problem with early disrespect is not always the disrespect itself. It is the permission it seeks. Once it enters a home and finds no resistance, it begins unpacking. The months that followed seemed happy enough to anyone watching from outside. Sizwe proposed with thoughtful elegance, not extravagance. He spoke about partnership, about building a life of meaning, about wanting a wife with substance rather than noise. Lindiwe cried when she said yes, not because the ring was large or the restaurant expensive, but because she believed she was stepping into a future where she would no longer have to carry everything alone. She imagined warmth. She imagined rest. She imagined that love, once chosen properly, could become a shelter from the roughness she had known. Their wedding was tasteful and intimate by the standards of wealthy families, though still far grander than anything Lindiwe had ever imagined for herself. Guests praised her beauty, her grace, the humility that made her seem well-raised, even when spoken by people who meant it as surprise. She stood beside Sizwe, surrounded by flowers and camera flashes, and thought perhaps the world had finally turned its face toward her gently. But even on that day there were signs small enough to ignore, sharp enough to remember later. Mamnomza corrected one of Lindiwe's relatives for taking the wrong seat. Ayanda joked too loudly about teaching village manners to city wives, though Lindiwe was not from a village at all. Sizwe heard it. He smiled faintly and looked away. There it was again, that silence of his, elegant and damaging. A woman can forgive many things in the beginning, when hope is still full in her chest. She can rename discomfort as adjustment loneliness, as maturity, and disrespect as misunderstanding. Lindiwe did all of that because she loved Sizwe, and because she did not yet know that the marriage everyone envied would become the place where her worth was, slowly, carefully, and almost professionally reduced. For a while she still believed love would correct what pride had started. It would take time for her to understand that some homes do not break a woman all at once. They do it politely. After the wedding, Lindiwe moved into Sizwe's world the way a careful person enters cold water, one measured step at a time, telling herself the discomfort would pass. The apartment they first shared in Santon was beautiful, in the restrained way wealthy people often preferred. Nothing was loud, nothing was excessive, but everything was expensive. The curtains fell in perfect lines, the kitchen surfaces reflected light like still water, and even silence in that place seemed curated. Lindiwe tried to make it a home, not just a residence. She cooked meals the way her mother had taught her, when life still held softness, with patience, memory, and the quiet belief that food could steady what words could not. She placed warmth into corners where modern design had left none. She learned the rhythms of Sizwe's days, the times he preferred tea instead of coffee, the way he liked his shirts arranged, the subjects that soothed him when work had been cruel. At first, she believed this was what marriage required, the shaping of one life around another, until both could move without collision. She did not mind giving. Giving had been her nature for so long that sacrifice often arrived, dressed as love. But little by little, she began to notice that she was doing most of the bending, most of the adjusting, most of the translating between worlds that only she seemed expected to cross. Sizwe never raised his voice in those early days. That was part of what made his behavior so difficult to name. Cruelty spoken gently can confuse even the person receiving it. If she offered an opinion about one of his professional dilemmas, he would smile and say, "You have a good heart, Lindiwe, but these matters are more complicated than they seem." If she asked why he had promised to attend a gathering for one of her siblings and then failed to come, he would kiss her forehead and say, "You know how demanding my work is. Don't make ordinary pressure feel like betrayal." When she tried to explain that his mother's remarks carried contempt, he would sigh as though she were adding burdens to an already full table. "My family has a certain way," he told her once. "Not every comment is an attack. You must stop looking for insult in everything." Lindiwe began apologizing for pain she had not created. That was how the pattern took root. Mam Nomza visited often, never without notice, but always as though the home remained partly hers to inspect. She moved through the apartment with the authority of someone who believed her son's marriage did not reduce her influence, but merely changed its setting. She praised cleanliness the way some people praise morality, implying that failure in one revealed failure in the other. If the dining table was laid differently from how she preferred, she would adjust a fork and say, "These things seem small, but they tell you whether a house has proper grounding." If Lindiwe wore a simple dress to lunch, Mam Nomza would tilt her head and murmur, "You are a lovely girl. With guidance you will become presentable in all environments." Ayanda was worse, because she made no effort to disguise herself. She came into the apartment carrying perfumes and laughter and opinions nobody had asked for. She mocked Lindiwe's old phone until Sizwe bought her a new one, then joked that marriage was at least improving her taste. She once opened Lindiwe's pantry saw, labeled jars of beans, rice, and mealy meal, and laughed as though she had discovered a museum exhibit. "My brother married a township auntie," she said. "Only you would organize dry food like the economy is ending." Sizwe laughed too lightly, absent-mindedly, as though the comment were harmless. Lindiwe smiled because she did not know what else to do, but she remembered. What neither Mam Nomza nor Ayanda understood was that Lindiwe's habits had not come from ignorance. They came from survival. She had not grown up in the kind of household where food simply appeared, because it was expected to. She had grown up in a two-room home, outside Pietermaritzburg, where every item had to earn its place. After her father died and her mother's health-weakened childhood became a luxury she no longer had. She learned to wake before dawn, boil water, braid her younger sister's hair, wash uniforms by hand, and calculate how to make one packet of maize meal last until Friday. She sold vetkoek outside taxi ranks before school. She mended clothes with such neatness that neighbors began bringing garments to her for a small fee. She sat with her siblings by candlelight and turned homework into games when they were too hungry to concentrate. If she sometimes stored food carefully or reused what wealthier people threw away without thought, it was because hunger had once sat at her family's table, often enough to become a silent relative. Those years had shaped her in ways no one in the Dlamini circle bothered to ask about. They saw restraint and called it lack. They saw modesty and named it inferiority. They had no idea that the woman they dismissed had already managed crises that would have shattered people softer than they were. Lindiwe's younger brother, Themba, understood her better than anyone. He was a nurse in training, then still lean from years of doing too much with too little. But his voice had steadied with adulthood. Whenever he visited Johannesburg, he watched Sizwe's home with careful eyes. He said nothing disrespectful, but Lindiwe could tell he did not like what he observed. One Sunday afternoon, after Mam Nomsa had spent half a lunch subtly correcting the way Lindiwe hosted guests, Themba stayed behind to help wash dishes. He stood beside his sister at the sink, hands in warm water, and asked quietly, "Are you happy here?" "Truly," Lindiwe answered too quickly. "Marriage takes time." Themba rinsed a plate and placed it on the rack. "That is not what I asked." For a moment she wanted to cry, not because things were unbearable yet, but because someone had seen enough to ask the right question. Still, loyalty held her in place. She told him there was adjustment, that Sizwe was under pressure, that families were complicated. Themba looked at her for a long moment before nodding. "Just don't disappear inside this house," he said. "You spent too many years becoming yourself." His words unsettled her because some part of her knew the disappearance had already begun. Not all of married life was openly painful. That made it harder. There were evenings when Sizwe came home tired and grateful, laid his head in her lap and let himself soften. There were weekends when they drove out beyond the city and laughed over small things, and in those moments, Lindiwe could still see the man she had believed in. He could be generous, even tender, when life flowed on terms that pleased him. He admired her ability to comfort, her instinct to care, the way she knew how to make a strained room feel human again. But even tenderness began to carry conditions. It was easiest when she needed nothing, most beautiful when she questioned little, most available when she remained the gentle witness to his life, rather than the full weight of her own. Then came the first real fracture, though it arrived quietly enough to be missed by anyone not standing inside it. Lindiwe had been invited to speak at a small women's entrepreneurship event through contacts from her community office days. The event was not glamorous, but it mattered to her. The women attending were seamstresses, informal traders, caterers, and mothers trying to turn side hustles into stability. Lindiwe had helped several of them over the years with paperwork, supplier leads, and local permits, and one organizer asked whether she would share encouragement about resilience and structure. She was nervous about public speaking, but she prepared seriously. She wrote notes. She ironed a cream blouse and navy skirt. She asked Sizwe days in advance whether he could attend, if only for a short while. He promised he would try. On the day, Lindiwe stood before nearly 60 women in a modest hall and spoke with a sincerity that reached them more deeply than polished language ever could. She told them that small beginnings were still beginnings, that discipline was a form of self-respect, that no one should wait for wealthy approval before building what their hands already knew how to make. The women clapped. Some cried. Afterward, several stayed behind to thank her. Lindiwe kept glancing toward the door, hoping Sizwe might slip in late. He never came. When she returned home that evening, she found him dressed for a corporate dinner he had never mentioned. Ayanda was there too, adjusting her earrings in the hallway mirror. "There you are," she said. "We thought you might still be motivating vegetable sellers." Sizwe did not rebuke her. He only said, "Lindiwe, I meant to call. Something more urgent came up." Something in her hardened then, not loudly, not completely, but enough to leave a mark. She looked at him in his tailored suit, at Ayanda smiling in reflected gold light, and understood for the first time that the things that mattered to her would always be considered small in that house, unless they could be translated into status. She went with them to the dinner anyway. She smiled when required. She carried herself with grace. But inside, a question had begun to breathe. What kind of marriage asks a woman to keep shrinking so everyone else can remain comfortable? The question stayed with Lindiwe long after the dinner ended. It followed her into sleep, into prayer, into the quiet moments between chores when a woman's mind begins telling her truths she has postponed for too long. She did not become rebellious overnight. That was never her nature. She still woke early, still prepared breakfast, still asked Sizwe about his schedule, still received Mam Nomsa with patience when she visited, and still absorbed Ayanda's careless remarks without returning them. From the outside, nothing dramatic changed. Inside, however, something had shifted. Lindiwe stopped assuming that love and respect were naturally traveling together in her marriage. She began to observe the distance between them. Sizwe noticed it before he understood it. He could not have named what was different, but he sensed that Lindiwe's silence no longer came from trust alone. It had grown more deliberate, more inward. She was still kind, still attentive, but a certain unquestioning softness had begun to disappear. At first he responded by becoming warmer in small ways. He brought home flowers one Friday evening, not because there was an occasion, but because he had noticed she seemed tired lately. He suggested dinner at a restaurant she liked. He even apologized in his way for missing the women's event, though the apology carried the polished caution of a man who wanted peace without examining its price. "I know that afternoon meant something to you," he said as they sat across from one another in the restaurant candlelight, moving faintly between them. "I should have handled it better." Lindiwe looked at him for a moment before nodding. "It did mean something to me." He reached for her hand. "You know I'm proud of you." The words might once have healed her immediately. Now they only made her ask a quieter question. Proud of what exactly? Proud of her mind, her labor, her character? Or proud in the way one is proud of something pleasant and well-behaved that reflects kindly on them? She did not challenge him that night. She simply smiled and let the moment pass. But from then on, she began paying closer attention to the structure of her own life. What she found unsettled her. Lindiwe realized that in marriage she had slowly become more useful than visible. Her emotional steadiness was expected. Her practical competence was relied upon. Her loyalty was assumed. But her ideas, ambitions, and instincts were treated as decorative until they proved directly beneficial to Sizwe's world. When his colleagues visited, and one of them spoke dismissively about township supply chains or informal women-run businesses, Lindiwe would quietly offer insight sharp enough to redirect the whole conversation. Men twice her age would pause surprised by the depth of her understanding. Sizwe would smile, sometimes even place a hand on her back with pride, but later in private, he would say things like, "You don't have to speak so much in those settings," or, "You made your point well, but there are strategic tones to these conversations." Strategic tones. It was one of his favorite phrases when he wanted to trim truth into something more flattering. Yet the truth was this: Lindiwe understood systems far better than most people suspected. She knew the rhythms of ordinary women's survival, how they sourced stock, borrowed informally, lost profit through middlemen, and built resilience without the protection of official language. She knew where transport costs swallowed hope, where paperwork became a form of exclusion, where small businesses died not from lack of skill, but from lack of structure. Years earlier at the community office, she had helped women fill forms and navigate municipal rules. But she had also been learning, studying patterns, listening to how money moved between people who were never invited into boardrooms, but kept entire local economies breathing. That knowledge had stayed with her. Marriage had not erased it. It had only covered it temporarily with domestic expectation. Around this time, an old contact named Nombulelo reached out to her. They had known each other from the resource office years, and Nombulelo now worked with a small network of women's cooperatives outside Johannesburg. Some processed dried produce, some supplied school kitchens, some made uniforms or packaged goods for informal retailers. Their biggest challenge was never effort. It was access to fair transport, to trustworthy bookkeeping, to buyers who would not exploit them, to small capital that did not arrive dripping with humiliation. "We don't need charity," Nombulelo told her one afternoon over tea in a modest cafe in Braamfontein. "We need someone who can see the whole picture and help us stop leaking money at every corner." Lindiwe listened for over an hour, asking the kind of questions that revealed she was not just sympathizing, but mapping. Volumes, fuel rates, storage gaps, seasonal waste, licensing bottlenecks, late payments. By the time they left, Nombulelo was staring at her with a look halfway between relief and disbelief. "You still have that mind," she said quietly. Lindiwe smiled faintly. It never left. That meeting stirred something powerful in her. For days afterward, she filled pages in a notebook with observations and possibilities. She began reviewing numbers from cooperatives Nombulelo sent her. She noticed where products were being undersold, where distribution routes were inefficient, and where even tiny changes could multiply stability across many households. She was not thinking yet in terms of empire. She was thinking like someone who had once known how one broken system could damage 10 lives at once. She wanted to solve things at the root. She worked mostly at the dining table when Sizwe was away, papers spread neatly, laptop open, tea cooling beside her. The work awakened a part of her that marriage had put to sleep. Hours would pass without her noticing. She built simple frameworks for stock tracking, payment schedules, bulk purchasing alliances, and transport pooling between women who had previously operated alone. She drafted templates for contracts in plain language, rather than legal intimidation. She made lists of small investors who might support quietly if approached properly. It was not glamorous work. No cameras would have lingered there. But Lindiwe felt alive in a way she had not felt for years. Sizwe first encountered this hidden revival almost by accident. One evening he came home earlier than expected and found documents across the dining table. He picked one up, glanced through it, and frowned. "What is all this?" Lindiwe looked up from her laptop. "I'm helping some women-led cooperatives organize supply and transport issues." He skimmed another page. "This looks extensive." "It is," she said. "There's real potential if they can build stronger systems." He sat down, loosened his tie, and read in silence for a moment longer. Then he gave a small, impressed laugh. "You did this?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "It's good. Surprisingly technical. Surprisingly." The word entered the room like a draft. Lindiwe's fingers stilled over the keyboard. Why surprising? Sizwe looked at her as though she were being unnecessarily sharp. "I didn't mean anything insulting. I only mean this is more advanced than the community support work you used to do. The women I used to support were always more advanced than people assumed," Lindiwe replied. He leaned back. "There you go again, taking a simple observation and turning it into a statement." There it was, that same elegant dismissal. Not loud enough to call abuse, just precise enough to reduce. Still, he was interested, at least in the abstract. Over the next few weeks, he asked questions now and then, mostly when her ideas intersected with sectors his clients respected. Once, after hearing her explain how informal producer alliances could become powerful regional suppliers with the right structure, he stared at her with genuine curiosity. "You think like an operator," he said. Lindiwe nearly laughed at the novelty of being seen for a second. "Maybe I always did." He smiled, but the smile carried tension. Recognition did not sit easily with men who were used to being the natural center of intelligence in their marriages. He enjoyed her insight when it appeared as a pleasant surprise. He became uneasy when it began to suggest autonomy. Soon that unease took shape in subtle corrections. When she mentioned meeting Nombulelo again, he asked whether it was wise to get too involved in other people's struggles. When she said she might register some consulting structures to help formalize her work, he reminded her that his schedule was demanding and he needed stability at home. When she spent a Saturday reviewing numbers instead of attending one of Ayanda's social lunches, Ayanda sent a voice note, dripping with mock sympathy. "So our Lindiwe is now a businesswoman. Please don't forget us when you become Minister of Dried Spinach." Mam Namsa was less mocking, more strategic. Over Sunday lunch, she listened as Sizwe casually mentioned Lindiwe's cooperative work, then dabbed her mouth with a napkin and said, "A woman should certainly have interests. It keeps her spirit bright. But one must be careful not to confuse activity with purpose. Marriage already gives a woman serious responsibilities." Lindiwe met her gaze. Building work that feeds families is serious responsibility too. Mamnomsa smiled, but the room cooled. Of course, though not every task must become an identity. Sizwe said nothing. Again. That silence wounded Lindiwe more than the insult itself. A husband did not need to shout to defend his wife. He only needed to refuse agreement with contempt. But Sizwe's gift had always been the preservation of comfort, especially his own. He disliked conflict when it demanded moral clarity from him. It was easier to let a sharp remark float than to puncture it and risk displeasing his mother. By then, however, something else had already begun beneath the surface. Through Nombulelo, Lindiwe was introduced to 2 women in Durban and 1 in Limpopo, who ran small but promising operations in food processing and storage. She studied their weaknesses, then their strengths. She connected one to a transport contact, another to better packaging suppliers, another to a school feeding contract opportunity. Nothing yet carried her name publicly. She preferred it that way. The work was cleaner without social performance attached to it. Quietly, carefully, she began putting small amounts of her own savings into pilot support structures. Not gifts, investments, designed to return, expand, and multiply. For the first time in years, Lindiwe began to feel that her life might still belong to her. But growth inside a marriage already shaped by hierarchy rarely goes unnoticed forever. The more awake she became, the less comfortable Sizwe seemed and the less patient his family grew. They had tolerated her as long as her light remained useful and contained. What none of them yet understood was that Lindiwe was no longer only surviving their world. She was beginning to build one of her own. Growth rarely arrives without resistance, especially in places where a person has been quietly trained to remain small. Lindiwe did not announce her change, did not declare a new identity, did not confront anyone with sudden defiance. She simply continued working steadily, deliberately, allowing her time and attention to shift towards something that fed her rather than diminished her. But in a house where her presence had always been measured against expectation, even that quiet shift felt like disruption. Sizwe began to notice that Lindiwe no longer arranged her days entirely around his. Meals were still prepared, the home was still orderly, and she remained attentive in ways most men would have called more than enough. But there were now hours that belonged only to her. Meetings she did not explain in detail. Calls she took with a focus that excluded everything else. Documents she reviewed with the kind of concentration that did not invite interruption. It unsettled him, not because she was neglecting him, but because she was no longer orbiting him completely. He did not express this discomfort directly at first. Instead, it came out in questions disguised as concern. "You seem very busy lately," he said one evening as she typed at the dining table, her eyes scanning columns of figures. I am, she replied without looking up. The cooperatives are growing. There's more to manage now. He leaned against the doorway, watching her. You don't have to carry everything yourself. These things can become overwhelming. They won't, she said calmly. Not if they are built properly. Sizwe nodded, but something in his chest tightened. He was used to being the one who defined what properly meant. Now he was watching his wife operate with a quiet authority that did not require his validation. It did not threaten him in obvious ways, but it disturbed the balance he had grown comfortable with. Nomza noticed even sooner. During one of her visits, she sat in the living room while Lindiwe finished a call in the kitchen. When Lindiwe returned, Nomza did not immediately speak. She watched her daughter-in-law the way one studies a subtle change in a familiar object. You look different, she said finally. Lindiwe met her gaze. Different how Nomza folded her hands. Occupied. A woman who is too occupied outside her home often forgets what sustains her inside it. My work is part of what sustains me, Lindiwe replied. Nomza's smile did not reach her eyes. Work is good, as long as it remains in its place. There it was again. Place. The invisible boundary Lindiwe was expected never to cross. But Lindiwe did not argue. She had begun to understand that not every battle needed to be fought with words. Some required quiet persistence instead. The real fracture, however, came not from her work, but from something far more personal. For a long time, Lindiwe had carried a private hope, one she rarely spoke about because it felt too delicate to expose. She wanted a child, not as proof of marriage, not as a symbol of stability, but as something deeply human, something that might bring softness back into spaces that had grown cold. In the early months of their marriage, she and Sizwe had spoken about it in passing, always with the assumption that there was time. But time, like respect, is often taken for granted, until it begins slipping in unexpected ways. When Lindiwe discovered she was pregnant, she did not rush to announce it. She sat alone for a long time, holding the knowledge in her body, feeling both fear and quiet joy. She imagined a different future, one where love might grow in a way that did not depend on approval or performance. She imagined a child who would never have to question their worth in the way she once had. She told Sizwe that evening. For a moment, something genuine broke through his composed exterior. He smiled, truly smiled, and pulled her into an embrace that felt almost like the man she had first fallen for. This is good, he said, his voice softer than usual. We will figure everything out. Lindiwe closed her eyes against his shoulder. For a brief, fragile moment, hope returned. But hope in that house had always been temporary. The weeks that followed did not unfold the way she had imagined. Sizwe became more attentive at first, but his attention carried tension. He began speaking more about timing, about how his career was entering a critical phase, about how responsibility required careful planning. Nomza's reaction was even colder. When a house is not yet fully stable, she said one afternoon, bringing a child into it can create more pressure than blessing. Lindiwe stared at her. A child is not pressure. Nomza tilted her head slightly. That depends on how prepared the parents are. Ayanda was less restrained. Honestly, I thought you would at least wait until you were properly settled, she said with a careless shrug. Now everything becomes complicated. Complicated, as though life itself were an inconvenience. Lindiwe tried to hold on to her own sense of meaning, but the atmosphere around her began to shift. What should have been a season of support became one of quiet resistance. Conversations about doctors turned into discussions about cost and timing. Small moments of care were replaced by practical considerations. Sizwe did not openly oppose the pregnancy, but his uncertainty was impossible to ignore. Then one morning, everything changed. It happened without warning. A sharp pain, a sudden weakness, a silence inside her body that felt wrong in ways she could not explain. By the time she reached the hospital, the truth had already begun settling into her bones before any doctor confirmed it. She lost the baby. The grief was not loud, it did not scream, it did not demand attention. It sat inside her like something heavy and irreversible, something that altered the shape of her from within. Lindiwe lay in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling an emptiness that no word could contain. Sizwe came, but his presence felt uncertain, almost careful. "I'm sorry," he said, standing beside the bed. She turned her head slightly. "So am I." He hesitated before speaking again. Maybe it's for the best." The timing wasn't right. The words landed harder than any cruelty Mamnomsa or Ayanda had ever offered. Lindiwe closed her eyes. She did not respond. There are moments when silence is not weakness, but the only way to prevent something sacred from breaking further. When she returned home, the house felt different. Not louder, not harsher, but emptier in a way that made everything else seem distant. Mamnomsa visited once, offering words that sounded like comfort, but carried no warmth. Ayanda sent a message that read, "You'll try again when things are more stable," as though loss could be scheduled and repeated at convenience. Sizwe tried in his way to move forward quickly. He spoke about work, about upcoming cases, about future plans. He avoided the subject of the child entirely, as though silence could erase what had happened. But Lindiwe could not move forward in the same way. Something inside her had shifted permanently. The grief did not weaken her. It clarified her. She began to see her life with a sharper, more honest lens. She saw the marriage not as she had hoped it would be, but as it truly was. A place where her pain could be minimized, where her value could be measured, where her existence could be adjusted to fit someone else's comfort. And for the first time, she asked herself a question she had been avoiding for too long. What happens when a woman stops choosing to stay? The answer did not come immediately. It rarely does. But the moment that would force her to act was already approaching, and when it arrived, it would leave no room for hesitation. Grief did not leave Lindiwe the way people often expect grief to leave. It did not come loudly and then fade. It settled. It stayed. It became part of how she moved, how she listened, how she measured the world around her. In the weeks after she lost the baby, she continued with her routines because routine was the only thing that gave shape to days that otherwise felt formless. She cooked, she cleaned, she answered calls, she reviewed documents, she spoke politely when spoken to. From the outside, she appeared composed, perhaps even strong. But inside, something had ended. Not just the pregnancy, not just the fragile hope she had held for a different kind of future. Something deeper, something more final, the belief that her marriage could still become a place of true safety. Sizwe noticed the change, but misunderstood it completely. To him, Lindiwe seemed quieter, more withdrawn, less responsive to small gestures. He interpreted this as distance rather than clarity. "You can't stay like this," he said one evening, standing in the doorway of their bedroom while she sat by the window staring at the city lights. Like what she asked, without turning. Closed, distant. "You need to move on." The words were not cruel in tone, but they carried an expectation that felt almost violent in its simplicity. Move on, as though grief were a task that could be completed. Lindiwe turned to face him slowly. "I am moving," she said. "Just not in the direction you want." Sizwe frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm beginning to understand things I didn't want to understand before." He stepped into the room, uneasy now. "You're letting this loss change how you see everything." "It already has," she replied. There was a silence between them, then one that felt heavier than any argument. Sizwe did not know how to respond because he had never learned how to sit inside discomfort without trying to control it, and Lindiwe no longer felt the need to soften her truth so that he could remain comfortable. In the days that followed, the distance between them became more visible. Not explosive, not dramatic, just undeniable. Lindiwe began spending more time outside the house, not as an escape, but as a continuation of the work that had begun to define her in ways her marriage never had. The cooperatives she supported were growing. Systems she had helped design were starting to stabilize, incomes reduce waste, and create small but meaningful expansions. Women who had once struggled to survive week to week were now planning months ahead. Some had hired assistants. Some had enrolled their children in better schools. The impact was not loud, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, Lindiwe felt something close to purpose. That purpose began to take form beyond informal support. Through one of Nombolelo's connections, Lindiwe was introduced to a discreet financial advisor named Kabelo Mokoena, a man known for working with unconventional investment structures. Their first meeting was cautious. Kabelo was used to clients who spoke loudly about ambition, but quietly feared risk. Lindiwe was different. She spoke less, but when she did, her clarity forced him to listen carefully. "You're not asking for charity frameworks," he said after reviewing her notes. "You're designing scalable systems." "Yes," she replied simply. "And you want to remain invisible for now." Kabelo leaned back, studying her. "That requires discipline. I have that. And patience. I've had no choice but to learn it." Something in her tone convinced him more than any document could. He agreed to help her structure her growing network into something stronger, more sustainable, and far more powerful than it appeared on the surface. It began quietly, a registered entity under a name that did not point back to her. Small investments that multiplied through efficiency rather than publicity. Strategic partnerships that connected rural production to urban demand without unnecessary intermediaries. It was not glamorous work, but it was precise, intentional, alive. Lindiwe did not speak about any of this at home, not because she was hiding out of fear, but because she had learned that not every truth needed to be shared in a space that could not hold it with respect. Sizwe, however, began to feel the shift in ways he could not ignore. Lindiwe was no longer waiting for his attention, no longer structuring her days around his presence, no longer softening herself to maintain peace. She was still kind, still respectful, but there was now a quiet independence in her that unsettled him deeply. One evening, after noticing she had returned late from a meeting without explanation, he confronted her more directly than he ever had before. "This is becoming a problem," he said, his tone controlled but firm. Lindiwe placed her bag down calmly. "What is you disappearing into work without communication? This isn't how a marriage functions." She looked at him steadily. "This isn't how a marriage functions." "Yes," he said, his voice sharpening slightly. "There has to be structure. There has to be understanding." Lindiwe held his gaze. "I've been living inside your version of structure since we got married." "That's not fair," he replied quickly. "No," she said quietly. "It's not." The simplicity of her response unsettled him more than anger would have. "You're changing," he said after a pause. "I am," she answered. "And you don't see how that affects this marriage." "I see it very clearly." Sizwe exhaled slowly, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Then explain it to me." Lindiwe shook her head slightly. "You don't want an explanation. You want me to go back to who I was before." "And what's wrong with who you were before?" he asked. She took a breath, steadying herself. Nothing was wrong with her, but she was invisible here. The words hung between them, undeniable. Sizwe looked at her as though seeing her for the first time, not as the quiet presence he had grown used to, but as someone who had been watching, understanding, and enduring far more than he had ever considered. "That's not true," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Lindiwe did not argue. She had learned the truth did not need to be defended repeatedly. It only needed to be spoken once clearly. The final moment came not long after, And like many defining moments in life, it arrived without ceremony. Mam Nomza had invited them for a family dinner. Lindiwe did not want to go, but she agreed out of habit more than desire. The evening unfolded predictably at first. Polite conversation, controlled laughter, subtle remarks disguised as concern. But then somewhere between the main course and dessert, the conversation shifted. Mam Nomsa looked at Lindiwe and said with quiet authority, "Sizwe tells me you've become very involved in outside activities." Lindiwe met her gaze. "I've been building work that matters to me." Mam Nomsa nodded slowly. A wife must be careful not to let personal ambition disrupt the balance of her home. Ayanda smirked lightly, especially when the home already provides everything she needs. Something inside Lindiwe stilled completely. She looked from one face to another. Sizwe said nothing, and in that silence, everything became clear. Not in a sudden, explosive way, not in anger, but in a calm, irreversible understanding. This was not a place where she would ever be seen fully. Not as she was. Not as she was becoming. Lindiwe placed her napkin gently on the table. "I think I understand now," she said. Sizwe frowned slightly. "Understand what?" She stood her movements steady, "that I've been trying to belong somewhere that was never meant to hold me." Mam Nomsa's expression hardened. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm leaving." The room fell silent. Sizwe stood abruptly. "Lindiwe, don't be dramatic." She looked at him one last time. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with a clarity that felt almost like peace. "I'm not being dramatic," she said softly. "I'm being honest." And with that, she walked away. No shouting, no pleading, no scene. Just the quiet sound of a woman choosing herself for the first time in a long time. By the time Sizwe fully understood what had happened, she was already gone. And this time, she would not be coming back. When Lindiwe left, she did not take much. That was the first detail people later used to measure her. No dramatic removal trucks, no legal threats, no public statements. She packed 2 suitcases, a small box of documents, and the few personal items that held meaning beyond appearance. She left behind expensive furniture, polished surfaces, and a wardrobe that had been slowly curated to fit a life that had never fully accepted her. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like surrender, like defeat. But leaving quietly is not always the same as losing. For the first few nights, Lindiwe stayed in a modest guest room owned by a woman named Thandeka, one of the earliest cooperative leaders she had supported. The house was simple, warm, and alive with the ordinary sounds of real-life children, laughing in the yard pots, moving in the kitchen, neighbors calling out across fences without ceremony. There were no curated silences there, no careful performances, just people living. Thandeka did not ask unnecessary questions. She gave Lindiwe space, tea, and a bed, understanding instinctively that some transitions do not need immediate explanation. "You can stay as long as you need," she said on the first evening. Lindiwe nodded, her voice steady. "Thank you." It was enough. In the days that followed, the reality of her new life began settling in. There was no longer a structured schedule shaped around someone else's expectations. No silent tension beneath polite conversation. No constant recalibration of her behavior to avoid subtle correction. The absence of those things did not feel like emptiness. It felt like space, space to think, space to breathe, space to become. But freedom, even when chosen, comes with its own weight. Lindiwe woke early out of habit, but now the quiet of morning belonged entirely to her. She sat by the small window in Thandeka's guest room, watching the first light stretch across the street, and allowed herself to feel everything she had not fully processed while inside the marriage. The grief of the child she lost, the years of quiet diminishment, the slow realization that love had not protected her in the way she once believed it would. She did not collapse under these emotions. She held them, examined them, let them settle into something that resembled understanding rather than chaos. And then she began to work. Without the constraints of her former life, Lindiwe's focus sharpened. What had started as a network of small, cooperative support structures began to evolve into something far more deliberate. With Cabello's guidance, she expanded her operational framework, registering additional entities that allowed for more efficient investment distribution and scaling. She studied contracts late into the night, refining language so that it protected those who had never been protected before. She built partnerships carefully, choosing alignment over speed. Within months, the systems she had quietly introduced began producing visible results. A dried goods cooperative in Limpopo secured a long-term supply agreement with a regional distributor, stabilizing income for dozens of families. A group of seamstresses in Durban transitioned from informal sales to structured contracts with school uniform providers. A small agricultural network near Mpumalanga reduced waste by over 40% after implementing shared storage and transport systems Lindiwe had designed. None of these successes carried her name publicly. That was intentional. She operated through layers of structure, allowing the work to speak without attaching her identity to it. In business circles, a new presence began to emerge, an entity known only through initials and strategic silence. Investors who encountered it described it as disciplined, unusually precise, and resistant to unnecessary exposure. No one knew exactly who stood behind it, only that its influence was growing steadily. Meanwhile, Sizwe's world moved in the opposite direction. At first, he dismissed Lindiwe's departure as temporary, a reaction, something that would settle once emotions cooled. He told himself she would return, after realizing how difficult independence could be, without the stability he had provided. His family supported this assumption. "She will come back," Mamnomsa said confidently. "They always do when reality corrects them." Ayanda laughed lightly, especially when they remember what they left behind. But days turned into weeks and weeks into months, and Lindiwe did not return. Sizwe began to feel something unfamiliar. Not regret, not yet. Disruption. The house no longer functioned the way it had before. Meals became inconsistent. The quiet he once enjoyed began to feel heavy rather than peaceful. Conversations with his mother and sister, once background noise, now felt sharper, more intrusive. Without Lindiwe's presence, the balance of the home shifted in ways he had never anticipated. Still, he refused to acknowledge the deeper truth. Instead, he focused on work. On the surface, his career continued to rise. He secured high-profile cases, maintained his reputation, and remained visible in professional circles. But beneath that surface, small cracks had begun to form. Financial decisions made under pressure, investments tied more to appearance than substance, and a growing dependence on maintaining status rather than building stability. He did not yet see how fragile that structure had become. Lindiwe, on the other hand, was building something entirely different.
Her work expanded beyond cooperatives into logistics and land management, creating integrated systems that connected production, storage, and distribution in ways that reduced dependency on exploitative intermediaries. She invested not in spectacle, but in efficiency, not in rapid growth, but in sustainable structure. Through Cabello, she gained access to networks that allowed her to scale quietly but powerfully. She learned how to move capital without attracting unnecessary attention, how to structure ownership in ways that protected both her and the communities she supported, and how to navigate spaces where influence mattered more than visibility. Years passed. The woman who had once been seen as a quiet, dependent wife became something entirely different. Not louder, not more aggressive, just more complete. She relocated to a modest but well-designed home that reflected her values rather than someone else's expectations. She supported her siblings more directly, now ensuring their stability without creating dependency. Themba completed his nursing training and began working in a hospital that served underserved communities, often funded in part by initiatives Lindiwe quietly supported.
But even as her life expanded, she did not forget where she came from. She returned often to the communities that had shaped her early work, not as a figure of authority, but as someone who still listened, still observed, still cared about the details others overlooked. One afternoon, while visiting a cooperative she had helped stabilize years earlier, an older woman took her hands and said, "You never came here looking important. That's why what you built stayed." Lindiwe smiled softly. "Important things don't always need to look important." The woman nodded. "But they change everything." That was the truth of Lindiwe's life now. She had changed everything, not through noise, not through recognition, but through quiet, deliberate action that reshaped lives from the inside out. And still, the world she had left behind had no idea who she had become. In Sizwe's circles, her name was rarely spoken anymore. When it was, it carried the tone of something dismissed, something resolved, something no longer relevant. "She disappeared," Ayanda said once at a social gathering. "Some people are not built for pressure," someone replied. Sizwe did not correct them. He did not know that while they spoke of her as though she had faded, Lindiwe was building something far beyond their understanding, something that would eventually intersect with their lives again. Not by accident, but by design. And when that moment came, the balance of power they had once taken for granted would no longer exist, because the woman they had underestimated had not disappeared. She had transformed. Power does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it moves quietly, gathering strength beneath ordinary appearances until the moment comes when it no longer needs permission to be seen. By the time Lindiwe's work had expanded into multiple sectors, her presence had begun shaping conversations she was never publicly part of. Contracts shifted because of structures she had designed. Supply chains stabilized because of networks she had built. Small enterprises that once struggled to survive were now operating with confidence, their growth rippling outward into communities that had long been ignored. And yet, her name remained absent. That absence was not accidental. It was protection. It allowed her to build without interference, to operate without being measured against expectations that had once confined her. She had learned that visibility, when poorly timed, could invite resistance from people who feared losing control. So she waited, she expanded, she strengthened. But even the most carefully constructed distance cannot prevent the past from finding its way back. The first sign came through Cabello. He arrived at one of their scheduled meetings with a file that did not belong to their usual work. His expression was controlled, but there was a weight behind it that Lindiwe recognized immediately. "This came through a legal network I monitor," he said, placing the file on the table. Lindiwe looked at it without touching it. "And it involves your former husband." She held his gaze for a moment, then reached for the file. The name Sizwe Dlamini sat clearly at the top of the document, followed by a list of claims tied to property, financial entitlement, and reputational interest. The case was structured aggressively, the language sharp, the assumptions clear. It positioned Lindiwe as a dependent former spouse attempting to claim assets she had not contributed to. It framed her departure as abandonment rather than choice. It implied weakness, instability, and a lack of independent means. For a brief moment, silence filled the room. Not shock, not anger, just stillness. Lindiwe closed the file slowly. "He believes I have nothing." Cabello nodded. "And he's prepared to prove it in court." There was no bitterness in her expression, only a quiet clarity. "He hasn't changed," she said. "No," Cabello replied. "But the situation has." Lindiwe leaned back slightly, her mind already moving through layers of implication. Legal strategy, exposure, timing, consequences. She understood immediately that this was not just a personal attack. It was a public one. A calculated move designed to assert dominance, to reframe their history, and to secure advantage before she had the opportunity to respond. He expects me to fold, she said. Yes. And if I don't? Cabello's voice remained steady. Then this becomes something very different. Lindiwe nodded once. It already was. Across the city, in a world that still believed it understood him, Sizwe was preparing for what he considered a straightforward case. To him, the situation was simple. Lindiwe had left the marriage without demanding anything. She had not contested assets. She had not created public conflict. In his mind, that meant she had no position of strength. When financial pressure began building quietly around his investments, when certain partnerships became unstable, and when liquidity tightened in ways he did not fully understand, he turned to what he knew best control, through legal structure. The case was not just about property. It was about reasserting dominance over a narrative he believed had drifted out of his hands. She will not fight this, he told his legal team confidently. She doesn't have the capacity. Mam Nomza agreed. A woman like that does not suddenly develop strength after leaving, she said. This will end quickly. Ayanda has always added her own edge. Maybe she'll finally understand what she lost, she said with a small smile. None of them questioned the assumption. None of them asked what Lindiwe had been doing in the years since she left. None of them considered that absence does not always mean inactivity. When the formal summons reached Lindiwe, she accepted it without hesitation. There was no panic, no visible distress. She read through the documents carefully, noting every detail, every assumption, every structural weakness in the case presented against her. She understood the strategy immediately. It relied on perception, on the idea that she had remained exactly as they remembered her. Quiet, dependent, limited, they were building their case on an outdated version of her. That was their first mistake. The second was underestimating her patience. Lindiwe did not respond immediately. She did not issue statements. She did not engage publicly. Instead, she began assembling her own team. Not loud lawyers. Not aggressive personalities seeking spectacle. She chose individuals known for precision, discretion, and an ability to dismantle arguments without unnecessary noise. People who understood that the strongest position in any legal battle is often the one that reveals itself last. Her lead counsel advocate, Naledi Kumalo, was a woman whose reputation did not rely on visibility. She spoke rarely in public, but in court, her presence carried weight that could shift entire proceedings. When Cabello introduced them, Naledi studied Lindiwe carefully before speaking. "You've already thought this through," she said. "Yes," Lindiwe replied, "and you're not interested in retaliation for its own sake." "No," Naledi nodded slightly. "Good. That makes this cleaner." Together they began preparing. Every document, every transaction, every structure Lindiwe had built over the years was reviewed, organized, and positioned with deliberate care. Nothing was exaggerated. Nothing was hidden. The truth as it existed was more than sufficient. Meanwhile, outside of legal preparation, the narrative around the case began to spread. In social circles connected to Sizwe's family, the story was predictable. Lindiwe was portrayed as a woman who had left impulsively, who had failed to build anything of her own, and who was now attempting to reclaim value she did not deserve. The tone was not openly hostile, but it carried the familiar undercurrent of dismissal. "She should have stayed where she was supported," Mam Nomsa said to a group of acquaintances. "Some people don't recognize opportunity," Ayanda added. "The narrative traveled easily because it fit expectations. A quiet woman leaves a powerful man. She struggles. She returns through legal means." It was a story people understood. What they did not understand was that this story had already changed, long before the case began. As the hearing date approached, subtle shifts began occurring beneath the surface. Certain financial institutions became unusually cautious in their dealings with Sizwe's associated entities. A few partnerships delayed decisions without clear explanation. Conversations that once moved quickly now carried hesitation. Sizwe noticed. "What is causing this?" he asked one of his advisors. The man hesitated before answering. "There are connections being reviewed. What connections we're not entirely sure yet." For the first time, uncertainty entered Sizwe's calculations. Not enough to stop him, but enough to create tension. Back on Lindiwe's side, preparation continued with quiet precision. She did not celebrate the coming confrontation. She did not frame it as revenge. To her, this was not about proving superiority. It was about truth, about closing a chapter that had once tried to define her in ways she no longer accepted. One evening, as she sat reviewing final documents, Cabello looked at her and asked a question he had been holding for some time. "Are you ready for what this will become?" Lindiwe paused, considering. "It already became something the moment he filed," she said. "And now?" She closed the file, gently. "Now," she replied, "it becomes visible." The courtroom date was set, both sides prepared, one with confidence built on assumption, the other with clarity built on reality. Neither yet understood how far apart those two things truly were. But very soon, everyone would. By the time the court date drew near, the case had already begun to live a life beyond the legal documents. It moved through conversations, through whispered assumptions, through the subtle networks that carried reputation, faster than truth ever could. In Johannesburg's polished social spaces, where perception was often treated as currency, the story of Lindiwe and Sizwe became something people discussed with quiet confidence, as though they already understood its ending. They did not. At brunch tables and private gatherings, the narrative remained comfortably one-sided. Lindiwe was spoken of as the woman who had walked away from stability, only to discover that independence came with consequences. Her silence over the years was interpreted not as strategy but as absence. Her lack of public presence was taken as proof that she had faded into irrelevance. "I heard she's been struggling," one woman said casually over coffee. "Well, that's what happens when you leave a man who built everything for you," another replied. Across the table, Ayanda smiled faintly, her posture relaxed, her tone light. "Some lessons are only learned the hard way." The group nodded in quiet agreement. Mam Nomza did not engage in gossip openly, but her influence shaped it just the same. When she spoke, it was with the calm authority of someone who believed her understanding of the situation was complete. "A marriage is not something a woman abandons lightly," she said during one gathering. "If she does, she must be prepared to face what comes after." The words were not loud, they did not need to be. They settled into the room, like truth. Meanwhile, in professional circles, the case attracted a different kind of attention. Lawyers, analysts, and business observers began reviewing the filings more carefully. On the surface, Sizwe's position appeared strong. The legal structure was clean. The claims were aggressive, but not unusual. The narrative of financial imbalance favored him. But beneath the surface, something did not align. A few individuals noticed inconsistencies, minor at first, then more pronounced. Certain financial assumptions lacked supporting clarity. Some asset claims seemed incomplete. A few references to external entities triggered quiet recognition among those who had encountered similar structures before, though they could not immediately place them. One senior attorney reviewing the case privately paused over a set of documents and frowned. "This doesn't look right," he murmured. "What do you mean?" his colleague asked. "There's something missing, or rather, something not being acknowledged." He could not explain it fully, but he felt it. That feeling began to spread. Back in Lindiwe's world, the atmosphere was entirely different. There was no gossip, no speculation, only preparation. Her team moved with the precision of people who understood both the stakes and the timing. Advocate Naledi Kumalo reviewed every document with a level of detail that left no space for oversight. Each argument was constructed carefully, not for immediate impact, but for cumulative effect. They were not building a response, they were building a shift. Lindiwe remained at the center of it all, not as a passive participant, but as the quiet force guiding direction. She attended every meeting, asked every necessary question, and ensured that nothing moved forward without alignment. One evening, as they finalized a key section of their strategy, Naledi looked at her and said, "You've been underestimated for a very long time." Lindiwe met her gaze calmly. "That has been useful." Naledi allowed herself a small smile. "It won't be after this. I know." There was no fear in her voice, only readiness. As the hearing approached, subtle shifts in Sizwe's world became more difficult to ignore. A scheduled investment meeting was postponed without clear explanation. A financial partner, who had previously been eager to expand, suddenly requested additional time for review. Even within his legal team, small questions began to surface, questions that did not challenge the case directly, but hinted at uncertainty. "Have we fully accounted for all external connections?" one junior associate asked during a briefing. Sizwe's lead counsel responded confidently. "Everything relevant has been addressed." The associate nodded, but the hesitation lingered. Sizwe himself felt the pressure building, though he refused to name it as such. Instead, he became more focused, more controlled, more determined to assert dominance through preparation. He spent longer hours reviewing documents, refining arguments, ensuring that every detail aligned with the outcome he expected. "She will not surprise us," he said firmly during one strategy session. His confidence reassured some, but not all. On the night before the hearing, the city seemed unusually still. Lindiwe sat alone in her study, the final documents arranged neatly before her. The room was quiet, not empty but full, in a way that reflected the life she had built. Every decision, every step, every moment of restraint had led to this point. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel anxiety. She felt clarity. Her phone vibrated softly on the table. A message from Themba. "No matter what happens tomorrow, you've already won in ways they will never understand." Lindiwe read the message twice before responding. "This is not about winning. It's about truth." She set the phone aside and returned her attention to the documents. Across the city, Sizwe sat in his own study, surrounded by polished surfaces and structured certainty. His files were organized, his arguments refined, his expectations clear. He believed he understood the situation. He believed the courtroom would confirm it. He believed that whatever Lindiwe had become since leaving it could not rival the position he held. Confidence, when built on incomplete understanding, can feel identical to certainty. That night, both of them prepared for the same moment, but they were not preparing for the same outcome. Morning arrived with quiet inevitability. The courthouse stood as it always had, indifferent to the lives it would shape within its walls. Lawyers moved with purpose, files in hand. Observers gathered with curiosity. The air carried the familiar weight of decisions waiting to be made. Lindiwe arrived without spectacle. No entourage, no display, just presence. She stepped into the building with the same calm that had carried her through years of transformation. Her posture steady, her expression composed. Some people glanced at her briefly, then looked away, seeing nothing unusual. Others looked longer, sensing something they could not yet define. Sizwe arrived shortly after his presence, more noticeable. His confidence visible in the way he moved. His family accompanied him. Their expressions composed, their expectations intact. Ayanda glanced toward Lindiwe and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Mamnomza's gaze was cooler, more measured but no less certain. To them, this was a conclusion, not a beginning. Inside, the courtroom seats filled gradually. The quiet hum of anticipation settled into place. Papers were arranged, voices lowered. The structure of the process took hold. Lindiwe took her seat without hesitation. Sizwe sat across from her, his posture straight, his expression controlled. For a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no anger in Lindiwe's gaze, no accusation, just a calm recognition of what had been and what was about to change. Sizwe held the look for a second longer than expected, then turned away. The judge entered. The room rose. And just like that, the moment they had both prepared for began. What neither side fully understood yet was that this was not simply a legal proceeding. It was the point where perception would collide with reality, and only one of them was built to withstand that impact. The courtroom settled into its formal rhythm, quickly, the kind of rhythm that disguises tension beneath procedure. Papers were aligned, voices lowered, and the authority of the space pressed gently against everyone present, reminding them that emotion would not lead the process, only structure would. Yet beneath that calm, something else was already unfolding, something less visible, but far more decisive. Lindiwe sat without movement, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her posture composed in a way that did not seek attention, but held it anyway. She wore no statement pieces, no symbols of status, nothing designed to impress. To anyone who did not know better, she appeared exactly as Sizwe's narrative had described her, a quiet woman, modest, unremarkable, possibly overwhelmed by the weight of what was about to happen. Across from her, Sizwe looked entirely at ease. His suit was sharply tailored, his presence confident, his expression controlled. He had spent years in environments like this, speaking, negotiating, persuading. The courtroom was not unfamiliar territory. It was a space where he believed he understood the rules, where preparation and precision could shape outcomes. His legal team began first. The opening statements were clear, structured, and assertive. They presented the case as one of imbalance of a marriage, where one party had carried the financial and structural weight, while the other had contributed little beyond presence. They spoke of stability, of responsibility, of expectation. They framed Lindiwe's departure as abandonment, her silence as evidence of incapacity, her lack of visible assets as proof of dependence. The language was careful, not openly cruel, but precise enough to define her without ever raising their voices. At one point, a faint murmur moved through a section of the courtroom when one of the attorneys remarked, "We are dealing here with an individual who has no demonstrated independent financial capacity." The statement hung in the air for a moment before dissolving into the formal progression of the case. Lindiwe did not react. She did not shift in her seat. She did not interrupt. She did not attempt to defend herself prematurely. She listened. That was all. But her silence was not empty. It was measured. Each word spoken against her was noted not emotionally, but structurally. Every assumption, every claim, every carefully constructed narrative point was absorbed and placed where it belonged, not in her heart, but in the quiet architecture of what would come next. Sizwe watched her from across the room, expecting some sign of discomfort, a change in expression, a flicker of reaction, something that would confirm the version of her he had built in his mind. He saw nothing. That unsettled him, more than any visible emotion would have. Still, he maintained his composure. Confidence does not collapse easily, especially when it has been reinforced by years of external validation. He turned his attention back to the proceedings, trusting in the strength of his position. The presentation continued. Documents were introduced. Financial records were outlined. The structure of the marriage was dissected in terms that reduced it to measurable contributions. The narrative remained consistent, controlled, and persuasive to those who did not look beyond what was being shown. In the gallery, reactions remained subtle. Some nodded slightly at key points. Others exchanged quiet glances that suggested agreement. A few observers more experienced remained still watching, not just what was being said, but how it was being constructed. One of them, a senior legal analyst, leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "They're pushing too clean a narrative." The colleague frowned slightly. Meaning, it leaves no room for complexity. Isn't that the point? Not when complexity exists, the analyst replied quietly. But the observation remained private. For now, when it was time for Lindiwe's side to respond, Advocate Naledi Kumalo stood. She did not rush. She did not raise her voice. She did not attempt to immediately dismantle the opposing argument. Instead, she began, simply. My lord, the narrative presented before this court is clear-structured and incomplete. The word incomplete settled into the room differently than anything that had been said before. Naledi continued, her tone steady, her delivery precise. We do not dispute that certain elements of the marriage were as described. What we will demonstrate, however, is that the assumptions drawn from those elements do not reflect the full reality of the situation. She paused briefly, allowing the weight of the statement to register. This case is not about absence of visibility, she said. It is about the misinterpretation of it. There was no dramatic reaction, but something shifted, not visibly, not yet, but perceptibly. Lindiwe remained still, her gaze forward, her presence unchanged. Yet the atmosphere around her seemed to deepen as though the space itself had begun to adjust to something not yet fully revealed. Naledi proceeded with careful restraint. She did not present everything at once. She introduced small points, each one precise, each one designed to create subtle pressure on the existing narrative. Minor inconsistencies, overlooked details, structural gaps in the assumptions made by Sizwe's team. Nothing explosive, nothing that would immediately overturn the case, but enough to introduce doubt. Across the room, Sizwe felt it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. He leaned slightly toward his counsel. What is she doing? He whispered. Building a foundation, the attorney replied quietly. Let her. Sizwe nodded, though something in his chest tightened again. He turned his attention back to Lindiwe. She had not spoken, not once, and yet somehow the direction of the room had begun to change. It was subtle, so subtle that many did not notice. But those who understood process could feel it. The case was no longer moving in a straight line. It was beginning to curve. As the session continued, Naledi introduced the first set of supporting documents. They were not dramatic, not at first glance, but they carried a different kind of weight. Records of involvement, structured participation. Evidence that Lindiwe's role within certain systems had been more complex than previously assumed. The courtroom did not react loudly, but attention sharpened. The judge leaned forward slightly. Sizwe's counsel adjusted his posture, and for the first time, Ayanda's expression shifted just slightly, just enough to reveal uncertainty. Mamnomsa remained composed, but her eyes narrowed with quiet calculation. Lindiwe did not move. She did not look at them. She did not acknowledge the shift. Because she had expected it. This was not the moment, not yet. This was only the beginning of the unraveling. Outside, the city continued as it always did, unaware of the quiet transformation taking place within the courtroom walls. Inside, however, something fundamental had begun to change. The narrative that had once seemed solid was no longer untouched. It had not collapsed, but it had been challenged. And once a narrative is challenged in the right place at the right time, with the right precision, it can never fully return to its original form. The session moved toward adjournment. No conclusions were reached, no final statements delivered, but the difference between expectation and reality had already begun to reveal itself. As people rose from their seats, conversations remained quiet, but the tone had shifted. Less certain, more attentive, Sizwe gathered his documents, his movements controlled, but his mind unsettled. Across the room, Lindiwe stood. For a brief moment, their eyes met again. This time something passed between them that had not existed before. Not recognition, not yet, but the first shadow of it, and that was enough. Because what had begun could not be stopped now. The truth had not yet been fully revealed, but it had already entered the room, and it would not leave without being seen. When the court adjourned that first day, people did not leave with the same certainty they had brought in. It was not obvious. No one stood outside announcing doubt. No headlines changed overnight, but in quieter corners, in the spaces where perception begins to shift before it becomes visible, something had already started to loosen. Sizwe felt it before anyone else in his circle admitted it. He remained composed as he exited the courtroom, walking beside his counsel with the same controlled confidence he had maintained all day. Mamnomsa moved with quiet dignity at his side. Ayanda just behind them, her expression still arranged into mild amusement. To anyone watching casually, nothing had changed, but Sizwe's mind was no longer still. What exactly did she introduce? He asked his lead counsel once they reached a more private space. Preliminary structural evidence, the man replied. Nothing decisive yet. Then why did it feel? Sizwe paused, searching for the right word. Different. The lawyer finished for him. Sizwe nodded. The lawyer exhaled slowly. Because it wasn't reactive. It was intentional. Sizwe frowned. Explain. She's not defending herself the way we expected, the lawyer said. She's building something, step by step. Sizwe's jaw tightened slightly. And that changes what? Not the outcome, the lawyer said carefully, but the path. Sizwe did not respond immediately. He had spent years mastering control through clarity. He understood arguments. He understood strategy. But what unsettled him now was not the content of what had been presented. It was the method. Lindiwe was not fighting. She was positioning. Across the city, Lindiwe's evening unfolded in a very different atmosphere. There was no celebration, no sense of victory. She returned home quietly, placed her files on the table, and allowed herself a moment of stillness. The day had not exhausted her in the way emotional conflict once did. Instead, it had sharpened her. Cabello arrived later that evening, not out of urgency, but out of habit. Their work had always been built on consistency rather than reaction. You held the line, he said simply. Lindiwe nodded. It's not time yet. He studied her for a moment. You're certain about the sequence? Yes. Cabello leaned back slightly. Then we continue as planned. There was no need for further discussion. They both understood that what mattered now was timing. Back in Sizwe's world, however, timing was beginning to slip. The next morning, his legal team reconvened early. Documents were reviewed again this time with a level of scrutiny that had not been applied before. One junior associate, more observant than vocal, spoke cautiously. There are references in her submissions that suggest broader involvement than we initially accounted for. Sizwe's lead counsel looked up. Be specific. The cooperative structures mentioned yesterday. The associate continued. They're not isolated. There are patterns that suggest centralized coordination. Sizwe's expression hardened slightly. Coordination doesn't equal ownership. No, the associate agreed, but it implies influence. And influence doesn't win cases, Sizwe said firmly. The associate nodded, but the hesitation remained. Mamnomsa, seated nearby, observed the exchange without interrupting. She had lived long enough to recognize when confidence was being defended, rather than expressed. Is there anything we should be concerned about? She asked calmly. The room fell quiet for a moment. No, Sizwe's counsel replied. Not at this stage. Not at this stage. The phrase lingered. When the second session began, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted subtly but undeniably. The initial confidence that had accompanied Sizwe's position was still present, but it was now layered with something else. Attention. People were watching more carefully, listening more closely. Lindiwe entered the courtroom the same way she had the day before, without spectacle, without hesitation. Her presence remained unchanged, but the way people perceived it had begun to evolve. Where they had once seen absence, some now sensed intention. Where they had once seen simplicity, a few began to recognize control. Sizwe noticed it, not in words, in glances, in the way certain individuals looked at Lindiwe longer than before, in the slight adjustments in posture among those who understood process. It unsettled him more than any argument could have. The proceedings resumed. This time, Naledi did not begin immediately. She allowed Sizwe's team to continue to extend their narrative to reinforce their position. It was a deliberate choice. The more complete their version became, the more precise the contrast would need to be. When she finally stood, her tone remained unchanged. "My lord," she said, "we will now address the assumptions underlying the claim of financial absence." The phrasing was careful. Not confrontation, correction. She introduced a new set of documents. Again, not explosive, but more detailed. Structured evidence of Lindiwe's involvement in multiple operational systems. Not ownership, not yet, but coordination at a level that could not be dismissed as incidental. Supply agreements, advisory roles, strategic contributions. Each document added weight. Not enough to collapse the existing narrative, but enough to strain it. Sizwe watched closely, his focus sharpening with each page. "What is this?" he murmured to his counsel. "Still preliminary," the lawyer replied, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "But it's connected," Sizwe said. "Yes." The acknowledgement settled heavily. For the first time, Sizwe began to consider a possibility he had not entertained before, that Lindiwe's absence from visibility had not been a result of limitation, but a choice. The realization did not fully form yet, but it began. Ayanda, seated behind him, leaned forward slightly. "This doesn't change anything," she whispered. Sizwe did not respond. Mamnomza remained still, her expression unreadable, but her attention fixed more intently than before. The courtroom absorbed the information in silence. No gasps, no dramatic reactions. But the energy had shifted again. What had once been a clear line was now a structure under pressure. Naledi did not push further. Not yet. She allowed the weight of the documents to settle, to exist without immediate explanation. Because explanation, when given too early, reduces impact, and she was not interested in reducing anything. As the session progressed, small cracks began to appear in Sizwe's argument. Not failures, not mistakes, but inconsistencies, points that required clarification, assumptions that no longer held as firmly. Each one addressed calmly, precisely, without aggression. That was what made it effective. There was nothing to resist, nothing to fight against directly, only truth placed exactly where it needed to be. By the time the session moved toward adjournment, the atmosphere in the room had changed once more. It was no longer about whether Lindiwe had capacity. It was about understanding the extent of it. And that question had not yet been answered. As people began to gather their things, the conversations that followed were quieter, more measured. "She's not what they said," one observer murmured. "No," another replied. "She's something else entirely." Sizwe heard fragments of these exchanges as he moved through the room. Each one added to the pressure, building beneath his composure. Outside, as he stepped into the daylight, Ayanda spoke again. "This is just noise," she said. "It doesn't change the outcome." Sizwe paused. For a brief moment, he looked back toward the courthouse. His expression remained controlled, but something in his eyes had shifted. Not fear, not yet, but awareness. Inside, Lindiwe remained seated for a moment longer after the room had begun to empty. Naledi gathered her documents, then glanced at her. "They're starting to see," she said quietly. Lindiwe nodded. "Yes." Naledi studied her. Next phase, Lindiwe looked down at the files before her, then closed them gently. Not yet, she said. Soon. Because the truth, once it begins to surface, does not rush. It unfolds, and what was coming next would not simply challenge perception. It would redefine it completely. By the third day of proceedings, the courtroom no longer belonged to one narrative. It had become a space of tension. Not loud, not chaotic, but stretched in a way that made every word matter more than before. People arrived earlier. They chose their seats more carefully. Conversations that once leaned toward certainty were now tempered with caution. The case had not yet turned, but it was no longer predictable. And unpredictability in spaces built on control is its own form of power. Lindiwe felt it, not as pressure but as alignment. She woke that morning before sunrise, as she often did, and sat quietly in her living room, the soft light touching the edges of a life she had built piece by piece. There were no distractions, no voices demanding explanation, just the stillness she had learned to trust. Her mind did not race. It moved deliberately, revisiting not just the case, but the path that had led her here. She remembered the girl she had been standing in, long queues, learning early that survival required both patience and observation. She remembered the young woman who believed love would offer safety, who entered marriage with hope rather than strategy. She remembered the years she had softened herself to maintain peace, the moments she had chosen silence over confrontation, not because she lacked strength, but because she had not yet understood where to place it. And she remembered the loss, not as pain alone, but as a point of clarity. There are moments in a person's life when everything that can be misunderstood is stripped away, leaving only what is real. For Lindiwe, that moment had not come in the courtroom. It had come long before, in a hospital room where no argument could change what had already happened. That was where she had learned that truth does not need permission. It only needs recognition. When she arrived at court that day, her presence carried that understanding. It was not visible in the way people usually measure strength. It did not announce itself, but it shaped everything around her. Sizwe noticed it immediately. He had spent the previous evening reviewing documents with renewed intensity, searching for patterns he had previously overlooked. The more he examined the material, the more he realized that what they were facing was not a reactive defense. It was a constructed position. And that meant something fundamental had been missed from the beginning. Still, he held on to control. He adjusted his posture, refined his focus, and entered the courtroom with the same external confidence he had maintained throughout his career. But internally something had shifted. He was no longer certain. He was calculating. The session began. This time, Naledi Kumalo did not wait. "My lord," she said, her voice steady, "we will now address the structural relationships previously referenced." The phrasing signaled a shift, not a reaction, a continuation. She introduced a series of documents that at first glance appeared administrative: corporate registrations, advisory agreements, investment frameworks. Each one connected to entities that had already been mentioned in earlier sessions, but now the connections were clearer, not complete, but clearer. These documents, Naledi continued, demonstrate not isolated involvement but sustained structural participation across multiple sectors. The courtroom remained quiet, but attention sharpened. She did not overstate the point. She did not attempt to force a conclusion. She allowed the evidence to exist in its own weight, knowing that its significance would grow as more pieces were introduced. Sizwe leaned forward slightly, his focus narrowing. "Trace those entities," he whispered to his associate. The associate nodded, already making notes. But even as they moved to respond, a problem began to emerge. The structures were layered, deliberately, not in a way that suggested concealment, but in a way that reflected design, and design implies intention. For the first time, Sizwe felt something he had not expected to feel in this case. Displacement, not of position, but of understanding. Ayanda, sensing the shift without fully grasping it, leaned toward him again. "This still doesn't prove anything," she whispered. Sizwe did not answer, because he was no longer certain of that. Mamnomsa remained composed, but her silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of confidence. It was the silence of assessment. Naledi continued, moving carefully through each point. She did not reveal everything. She did not need to. What mattered was the direction. Each document, each reference, each connection moved the narrative further away from the original assumption. Lindiwe was not absent. She had been present, strategically, consistently, at a level that could no longer be dismissed. But the full scope remained just out of reach. That was intentional, because revelation, when delivered too early, loses its force, and this was not about speed. It was about precision. As the session progressed, the judge began to ask questions. Not many, but enough. Clarifications, requests for context, points that required explanation. Each question shifted the weight of the room slightly further. Sizwe's counsel responded carefully, maintaining structure, reinforcing their position where possible. But the clarity they had relied on was no longer intact. It had been complicated, not by argument, but by reality, and reality does not negotiate. It accumulates. During a brief recess, Sizwe stepped aside with his legal team. We need to understand the full extent of this. He said, his voice controlled but firm. We're working on it, his counsel replied. That's not enough, Sizwe said. I want clarity. We'll have it, the lawyer assured him, but the assurance felt thinner than before. Across the hall, Lindiwe stood with Naledi, her expression unchanged. They're beginning to see the structure, Naledi said quietly. Yes, Lindiwe replied. Naledi studied her for a moment. You've held this position for years. Lindiwe nodded. I had time. And now Lindiwe's gaze shifted slightly, not toward Sizwe, but toward the courtroom itself. Now it becomes visible. Naledi did not ask further. She understood. When the session resumed, the atmosphere had tightened further, not tense in the usual sense, focused. The kind of focus that comes when something important is approaching, even if it has not yet arrived. Naledi introduced one final set of documents for the day. Again, not complete, but enough to suggest scale. Multiple sectors, multiple regions. Interconnected systems, not random, not incidental, structured. The courtroom absorbed it in silence. No reactions, no interruptions. But the shift was undeniable. The narrative that had once framed Lindiwe as dependent was no longer sustainable. It had not yet collapsed, but it could not hold. As the session moved toward adjournment, the judge looked over the documents once more before speaking. This court will require further clarification on the relationships presented, he said. The statement was formal, but its implication was clear. The case had changed. Outside, as people began to leave, the conversations carried a different tone entirely. Not dismissal, not assumption, inquiry. What exactly is her position? Someone asked. No one seems to know, another replied. That's the problem, a third voice added quietly. Sizwe heard enough to understand that the ground beneath him was no longer stable. For the first time, he did not look toward Lindiwe with dismissal. He looked with recognition. Not complete, but beginning. Lindiwe, meanwhile, walked out of the courtroom without pause. She did not look back. She did not need to, because the moment she had prepared for over years was no longer approaching. It had begun. And when the final truth emerged, it would not simply answer questions. It would end them. By the fourth day, the courtroom no longer belonged to Sizwe. That shift was not declared. No one stood up and announced that the balance had changed. But it was there in the way people entered the room, with a different kind of attention, in the way whispers had stopped sounding certain and started sounding cautious, in the way even silence had begun to carry weight. The narrative that once seemed complete had been opened, and once opened, it could not be closed again without consequence. Lindiwe arrived as she always had, calm, unhurried, unaffected by the gradual transformation around her. But this time something else moved with her. Expectation. Not hers, the room's. Sizwe felt it immediately. As he took his seat, he became aware of eyes on him, not admiring, not dismissive, but measuring. It was a subtle difference, but a significant one. For years he had operated in environments where his presence defined the tone of the room. Now, for the first time, he felt that tone shifting away from him. He adjusted his posture, his expression, his focus. Control. He needed to maintain control, but control built on incomplete understanding is fragile, and that fragility had begun to show. The session opened with Naledi Kumulo, standing once again, her movements deliberate, her presence steady. "My lord," she said, "we will now provide further clarification on the structural relationships previously introduced." The phrasing was consistent, but the moment was not. This was no longer preparation. This was transition. She began with a witness, not a dramatic figure, not someone designed to command attention through presence alone, but someone precise, a financial analyst who had worked indirectly with several of the entities referenced in earlier sessions. His testimony was calm, technical, and exact. He did not speculate. He did not embellish. He simply explained. "How would you describe the coordination between these entities?" Naledi asked. The analyst adjusted his glasses slightly before responding. "Structured," he said. "Deliberate, consistent over time. And in your professional opinion, would such coordination occur without centralized strategic direction?" "No," the analyst replied. "Not at this scale." The answer did not echo. It did not need to. It settled. Naledi continued. "Would you describe the individual responsible for that direction as passive?" The analyst paused briefly. "No." A small shift moved through the courtroom, not visible in movement, but in understanding. Sizwe's counsel rose quickly. "My lord, we object to speculative characterization." Naledi did not resist. "My lord, the witness is responding within the scope of professional analysis." The judge considered briefly. Objection noted. The court will consider the weight of the testimony accordingly. The exchange was controlled, but the effect remained, because the question had been asked, and the answer had been given. Sizwe leaned slightly toward his counsel. "This is framing," he said quietly. "Yes," the lawyer replied. "And it's effective." Sizwe's jaw tightened. For the first time, he was no longer ahead of the structure. He was inside it. Naledi proceeded carefully. She introduced additional documentation this time, more explicit in its connections. Financial flows, strategic alignments, operational decisions that traced back not to isolated individuals but to a central point of coordination. Still, she did not name it. Not yet. The tension built, not through volume, through accumulation. Each piece of evidence narrowing the space in which the original narrative could exist. Across the room, Ayanda's composure began to crack. "This is ridiculous," she whispered under her breath. "It doesn't prove anything." But her voice lacked conviction. Mam Nomsa remained still, but her attention had sharpened to a degree that revealed more than any reaction could. She was no longer dismissing what she saw. She was calculating, and what she was calculating did not align with what she had expected. Sizwe felt it more clearly now. Not just doubt, displacement. The structure of the case had moved beyond his control. He had built his position on an understanding of Lindiwe that no longer applied, and he was only beginning to see it. Naledi paused briefly, allowing the weight of what had been presented to settle fully into the room. Then she moved to the next stage. "My lord," she said, "we will now address ownership." The word landed differently, heavier, more final. Sizwe's attention sharpened immediately. Ownership. This was the point where assumption would either hold or collapse. Naledi did not rush. She introduced a set of documents that had not been referenced before. corporate filings, investment structures, holding arrangements, each one connected to the systems already discussed. But now the connections were no longer indirect. They were aligned, deliberately, clearly. The courtroom leaned into the moment without realizing it. No one moved. No one spoke. But every eye followed the documents as they were presented. Sizwe felt something shift inside him. Not fear, recognition, incomplete, but undeniable. His counsel began reviewing the documents quickly, their movements more urgent than before. "Trace the ownership layers," Sizwe whispered. "We are the lawyer," replied, his tone tight. But even as they worked, the pattern was becoming visible. Not fully, but enough. Naledi continued, her voice unchanged. "These documents," she said, "demonstrate structured ownership across multiple entities operating within interconnected sectors." She paused. "And they establish a consistent point of strategic origin." The phrase settled into the room, like something waiting to be completed. But she did not complete it. Not yet, because the moment required precision, not speed. The judge reviewed the documents carefully, his expression neutral but focused. "This court will require direct clarification of the origin referenced," he said. Naledi inclined her head slightly. "It will be provided, my lord." The room held its breath without knowing it, because everyone understood, even if they could not yet articulate it, that something significant was about to be revealed. But not today, not fully. As the session moved toward adjournment, the tension remained suspended. Unresolved, intentional, outside the atmosphere had changed completely. There was no more confident gossip, no more casual dismissal, only questions. Who is behind those structures? Why wasn't this known before? How deep does this go? Sizwe stepped out into that atmosphere and felt it press against him in a way he had never experienced before. For years he had controlled narrative, now he was subject to it. Ayanda turned to him, her voice sharper than usual. "This is getting out of hand." Sizwe did not respond because for the first time he did not know how to. Mamnomsa spoke quietly. "We need to understand what we are dealing with." Sizwe looked back toward the courthouse. His expression remained controlled, but his certainty had fractured. Inside, Lindiwe stood with Naledi for a moment longer. "It's time," Naledi said. Lindiwe nodded. Yes, there was no hesitation, no doubt, because everything had been prepared for this. Every step, every layer, every moment of silence. The truth had been built carefully, and now it was ready. Tomorrow it would no longer be suggested. It would be known, and once known, nothing would return to what it had been. The courtroom was fuller than it had been on any previous day. Word had spread not loudly, not officially, but through the quiet channels that carried importance faster than announcements ever could. People who had no direct connection to the case found reasons to be present. Legal observers, analysts, and even a few figures from business circles took seats early, their attention sharpened by a single question that had not yet been answered. Who was Lindiwe Maseko? By the time the judge entered the room, was no longer simply attentive. It was waiting. Lindiwe felt it the moment she stepped inside. Not pressure, expectation. It moved through the room, like a current, subtle but undeniable, touching every person present. She did not respond to it outwardly. Her posture remained the same, her expression unchanged, but internally she recognized the moment for what it was. This was not the beginning. It was the unveiling. Across the room, Sizwe sat already in place, his presence still controlled but no longer effortless. The previous days had stripped away the certainty he had carried into the case. What remained was discipline, focus, and a growing awareness that the outcome was no longer within his command. Mamnomsa sat beside him, her composure intact, but her silence heavier than before. Ayanda, for the first time, did not speak. The proceedings began. Naledi Kumalo stood. She did not open with argument. She did not repeat what had already been established. Instead, she allowed the room to settle fully into its own anticipation before speaking. "My lord," she said, her voice steady, "we will now provide direct clarification of the structural origin referenced in previous sessions. No movement, no interruption, only attention." She turned slightly, signaling to her team. A document was placed before the court. Not a stack, not a series, a single file. The simplicity of it carried more weight than volume ever could. "This document," Naledi continued, "represents the consolidated ownership structure of the entities previously discussed." The words were precise, measured, irreversible. The file was opened. For a moment, nothing happened. The judge reviewed the document silently. Then again, slower. Across the room, Sizwe leaned forward slightly, his focus narrowing completely. His counsel followed their attention, fixed, their composure tightening. Ayanda's hands clasped together unconsciously. Mamnomza did not move at all. The silence deepened, not empty, heavy. Then the judge looked up. "Advocate Kumalo," he said, "are you confirming that the structures presented are held under a single controlling interest?" Naledi inclined her head. "Yes, my lord, and that controlling interest belongs to—" She did not rush. She did not dramatize. She simply turned slightly. Toward Lindiwe, the respondent, she said. The word did not echo. It did not need to, because the room had already absorbed it. For a fraction of a second, time seemed to pause, not literally, but perceptibly. The kind of pause that occurs when understanding arrives faster than the mind can process it. Sizwe did not move. He did not speak, but something in his expression shifted in a way that could not be concealed. Recognition, not of detail, but of scale. Ayanda's composure broke first. "That's not possible," she whispered, though her voice carried further than she intended. No one responded. Mamnomza remained still, but the certainty that had defined her presence throughout the case had vanished completely. What remained was something quieter. Shock. Not loud, but absolute. The courtroom did not erupt. It did not need to. Because the impact was not external, it was internal. Each person present was adjusting their understanding in real time, reconstructing everything they thought they knew. Naledi continued, her tone unchanged. The respondent has over a period of years established and maintained a series of interconnected business structures across multiple sectors, including logistics, agriculture, manufacturing, and regional distribution. She did not emphasize the scale. She did not need to. The document spoke clearly enough. These structures, she added, have generated sustained economic impact across multiple regions and operate under consolidated strategic direction. The judge nodded slowly, his attention returning to the file and the valuation he asked. Naledi responded without hesitation. Based on current assessments, the combined value exceeds the threshold of private billion-level holdings within the region. The words settled into the room with finality. There was no space left for reinterpretation, no room for dismissal. The woman who had been described as dependent, as absent, as incapable, was none of those things. She was something entirely different. Sizwe exhaled slowly, though he had not realized he had been holding his breath. His mind moved rapidly, attempting to reconstruct years of assumption in a matter of seconds. The quietness, the absence, the lack of visible demand. None of it had been weakness. It had been control. He looked at Lindiwe, really looked at her for the first time. And in that moment he understood something that could not be undone. He had never known her, not truly, not even close. Ayanda leaned back in her seat, her expression no longer composed, no longer certain. "How?" she murmured, though the question had no immediate answer. Mamnomza closed her eyes briefly, not in defeat, but in recalibration. a lifetime of reading people. And she had misread this one completely. Lindiwe remained still. She did not react to the shift, did not acknowledge the shock, did not claim the moment, because it was not a moment she needed to take. It was one she had already built. Naledi concluded simply, "My lord, the assumption of financial absence is therefore not only incorrect but fundamentally flawed." The statement did not challenge, it corrected, and that correction changed everything. The judge leaned back slightly, considering the full weight of what had been presented. "This court will take this into account as proceedings continue," he said. Formal, measured, but definitive, the session did not end immediately. Procedural steps followed. Clarifications, documentation. But none of it carried the same impact as what had already been established, because the central truth had been revealed, and it could not be reversed. When the court finally adjourned, the room did not erupt into noise. It remained quiet, but the quality of that quiet had changed completely. Outside, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Not speculation, not rumor, confirmation. "Did you hear? It's true. She's—" The words struggled to keep pace with the reality. Sizwe stepped out into that world and felt it press against him fully. Not as admiration, not as respect, but as consequence. Ayanda followed her voice, unsteady for the first time. "This doesn't change anything legally," she said, though the statement sounded more like a question than a fact. Sizwe did not respond because he knew it changed everything. Mamnomsa stood beside them, her posture still controlled, but her silence now carried a different meaning. Not authority, acceptance. Inside, Lindiwe remained for a moment longer. Naledi gathered the final documents and looked at her. "It's done," she said. Lindiwe nodded. Yes. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction in the shock she had caused. Only stillness. Because this had never been about proving something to them. It had been about no longer being defined by them. As she walked out of the courtroom, no one laughed, no one whispered, no one dismissed. They watched, because the woman they thought they understood had just redefined everything, and nothing would return to what it had been. After the revelation, the courtroom did not return to normal. There are moments that divide time quietly, without ceremony, where everything before them belongs to one version of reality, and everything after belongs to another. What had been revealed was not simply information. It was correction, and correction, once accepted, reshapes every interaction that follows. The final session began with a different kind of silence, not anticipation, understanding. Lindiwe took her seat, with the same calm she had carried from the beginning. But now, the room did not look at her with dismissal or even curiosity. It looked at her with awareness, not complete, not intimate, but enough to recognize that the woman before them had never been what she was assumed to be. Sizwe felt it more than anyone. He had spent the previous night in a state he could not name easily. It was not regret in the way people often understand regret. It was something deeper, more unsettling, reconstruction. Every memory of Lindiwe had begun rearranging itself in his mind. The quietness he had dismissed, the patience he had taken for granted, the restraint he had mistaken for limitation. Each one now carried a different meaning. He remembered the evenings she had sat at the dining table, reviewing documents he never asked about. He remembered the conversations he had redirected, the ideas he had softened, the presence he had reduced without realizing it. He remembered the moment she said, "I was invisible here." And for the first time he understood that it had not been an accusation. It had been a statement of fact. The session opened with procedural continuation, but the tone had shifted completely. Sizwe's counsel adjusted their approach, no longer relying on the original narrative. They spoke more carefully, acknowledging complexity, attempting to reposition their claims within a structure that now had to account for Lindiwe's established position. But the adjustment came too late, because the foundation of their argument had already been removed. Naledi Kumalo stood once more, not to escalate, but to conclude. "My lord," she said, "the matter before this court is no longer one of assumption, but of clarity." She did not raise her voice. She did not emphasize the shift. She simply acknowledged it. The respondent has demonstrated independent financial capacity, sustained structural influence, and a consistent record of strategic development across multiple sectors. Each phrase landed with quiet finality. The claim of dependency is therefore unsupported. There was no need to argue further, because the truth had already done the work. The judge reviewed the final submissions carefully. His expression composed, his attention precise. The decision that followed was structured, measured, and aligned with what had been established. The claims against Lindiwe were dismissed, not dramatically, not with force, but with certainty. The legal conclusion was clear, but the deeper conclusion existed beyond the court's authority, because what had been corrected was not just a legal narrative, it was a human one. As the session ended, people rose slowly, not hurried, not distracted. Present. Sizwe remained seated for a moment longer than necessary. He did not move immediately. He did not speak, because for the first time in his life he had nothing to assert, no position to defend, no narrative to control, only understanding. When he finally stood, his movements were controlled but stripped of the confidence that had once defined them. He turned, and for a brief moment he looked at Lindiwe, not as his former wife, not as someone he had lost, but as someone he had never truly seen. "Lindiwe," he said. His voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. She stopped, turned slightly, met his gaze. There was no anger in her eyes, no resentment, only clarity. "I didn't know," he said. The words carried weight, but they did not carry power, because knowledge once missed cannot be recovered in the moment it becomes necessary. Lindiwe held his gaze for a moment before responding. "I know," she said. That was all. No accusation, no explanation, because none was needed. Mamnomza approached slowly, her posture still composed, but her presence altered. For the first time since Lindiwe had known her, she did not speak with authority. She spoke with restraint. "You built all of this," she said. It was not a question. It was recognition. Lindiwe nodded once. "Yes." Mamnomza studied her, the weight of years of misjudgment settling into a single moment. "I misjudged you," she said quietly. Lindiwe did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but because she understood the difference between apology and realization. "They all did," Lindiwe said finally. Not harsh, not soft, just true. Ayanda stood a few steps behind, silent. For once, she had nothing to say, because everything she had believed had been proven incomplete. Lindiwe did not stay longer than necessary. She gathered her things, turned and walked out. No audience, no performance, no need. Outside the city moved as it always did. Cars passed, people spoke, life continued. But for Lindiwe, something had closed. Not with noise, not with finality, but with completion. She stepped into the light without looking back, because she no longer needed to. The past had no authority over her anymore. Not its judgment, not its assumptions, not its silence. She had already carried those things, learned from them, built beyond them, and now she was free. Not because the court had said so, but because she had chosen it long before.
Sometimes the greatest mistake people make is not cruelty. It is assumption. We measure others by what they choose not to show, by what they do not demand, by how quietly they carry themselves. We mistake silence for weakness, humility for lack, patience for limitation. But the truth is not everything valuable is visible. Some people build in silence, grow in hidden places, rise without announcing themselves, and when their truth is finally revealed, it does not just surprise the world.
It corrects it. Lindiwe's story is not about wealth. It is about dignity, about the quiet strength it takes to walk away from spaces that cannot see you, and the even greater strength it takes to build a life that does not need their recognition. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever underestimated someone else? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let your voice be part of this conversation. And if you believe in stories of justice, healing, and quiet transformation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us to look again, more carefully, more honestly, more humanly.